afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I was actually signalling to the box because I think should be on streaming now. So it was just to signal to the box that we were ready. So good afternoon again, everybody, and thank you all for coming along. We're well aware that you've probably had enough of governance for one day. Most people have had enough after about the first 5 minutes. But so we're very thankful so many of you are still here, and because we would like to perhaps continue to some extent what you heard this morning. I'm not sure there'll be quite as many jokes as there were this morning, so sorry about that. But let me start by saying that those of you who were here last year will know that this very session, Ian and I, did a session on governance, and we had a bit of a question and answer session. And it was a sort of issues and ideas session. Issues of the trust governance, things like the various regional sizes, the different tenures of the different kinds of trustees, the size of the NEC and the effect on decision making, it was touched on this morning, the status of networks, just to give a few of the issues we tried to raise last year. And we also threw up some ideas about what we might do to try to tackle some of those issues, things like was there a case for having a much smaller National Executive Committee supported by a statutory, advisory or consultative forum or council? Were there electoral procedures for trustees and so on appropriate? Should there be skills criteria to be a trustee? Committee and working group membership, should there be more non-trustee membership of committees and working groups, and how might networks develop in the future? Those were the sort of ideas we threw out, and we indicated that Pam Jones, where are you, Pam? There you go, had the intention to set up a consultation working group at that time. I think like a few of us were very interested in a lot of the questions and answers that we got, and Pam decided she would go ahead and set up a consultation working group, and that consultation working group would report back to the next AGM, that's this one, in 2017. So our purpose today is to tell you about what the consultation group did, the sorts of things it was hearing, and just to report back what we found out. Let me start by introducing the consultation working group. I haven't introduced myself, but I'm Graham Clarke. I was co-opted trustee last year, and previous to that was the Scottish trustee. Michaela Moody in the centre there, vice chairman, and a previous trustee of the East Midlands, and Ian McCannah, now a vice chairman as of this morning, and previously, the last 3 years, the trustee for London. So the three of us made up this consultation working group. I'm going to show you, we tried to run this group, nobody was chair of it. We were 3 members and 3 chairmen, and sometimes it seemed like that. So we've decided to continue that, and nobody's going to actually chair this session this afternoon. But I am going to tell you, report back on what our findings were and what our recommendations were to be. Michaela is going, and that's in the blue underneath who we are. Michaela is going to talk after me on the proposed structural changes to the memorandum and articles. And Ian is going to pick up a lot of the non-structural issues that were brought up during the consultation. I should just say that the consultation, although it was meant to be entirely about the governance structure of the trust, inevitably we got a lot of comments about a lot of things, and Ian is going to pick up on those non-structural issues that kept on coming up and obviously were of importance to the members. So those are who the working group were and what we're going to feed back. For those who weren't with us last year, I'm just going to give a very, very short sort of historical background. First of all, the memorandum and articles really date from 2008. And there have been one or two amendments of them, but fundamentally they are of 2008 era. And some people would say, well, you should be looking at them at least once every 10 years anyway. And we have been doing that. But increasingly through that period, 2008, right through to 2015-16, there were letters appearing in Third Age Matters. The chairman, the respective chair, and certainly Pam was receiving a number of letters from a number of members from all over the country saying, was the NEC, was it fit for purpose? It tended to be the phrase that was being used. So the whole issue sort of heated up a little bit. There were continued articles in Third Age Matters about this fitness for purpose. The NEC itself was spending more and more time talking about whether the articles and memorandum needed changed. And the whole thing culminated, in a sense, at that question and answer session last AGM and the setting up of the consultation working group. So that's the sort of very potted version of the history of what we're about today. Let me just talk now a little bit about the process that the three of us, with help from others and advice from others, set in place. During the period September, immediately after last year's AGM, and technically the end of February, but I called it March 2017. It's that 7-month period when the consultation process was in place. There were 5 sort of activities that we focused in on. The first was the creation of a focus group. This was a sort of a group of people selected, admittedly, but some self-selected themselves. These were people who had written these articles that had appeared in Third Age Matters and had taken an immediate interest in the work that the consultation group would be going about. So we invited 20 people to join the focus group, and they were to be a sort of bounce-off group. We would present ideas to them and get feedback from them and so on. Most of them had been officers of their own U3As, and I think probably all of them had at least been vice chair. Certainly there were a number of chairs. Quite a number had been trustees, and 3 had been past chair of the NEC, and 1 was the founder member. So we had previous experience in that focus group. Oops, there we go. We asked every one of them, all 20, to produce a submission. Just tell us what your views are on what's wrong with the current NEC and what would you do to improve it. So that was the start. We then issued an online questionnaire. It was a little broader than just questions about the future of the NEC, but one of the questions in particular was related to this consultation exercise. And just to put a few figures on it, we received 477 returns from 415 U3As. So clearly there are U3As where the secretary doesn't talk to the chairman. But anyway, there was nothing to prevent U3As putting multiple responses in, and some did. But 415 U3As is 41% of the U3As that we have. That's a remarkably good response rate for a questionnaire. So we were very pleased with that. There were also more and more articles, and those who are avid readers of Third Age Matters probably noticed that throughout the period from mid-2016 right through to mid-2017 and indeed beyond, that there were continuing articles about the consultation process, and there will be a summary of this session in the next TAM. And Chairman Pam Jones kind of started that and wrote a couple of articles that encouraged people to respond directly by email, and we set up a separate email address. And perhaps slightly disappointingly, we got 32 responses directly that we know from articles in Third Age Matters. So that was the third activity. The fourth one was that the consultation group set up a series of meetings, and our ambition was to have a meeting in every region. We achieved that and more. There were in fact 22 regional or network meetings, and one of the three of us went to every one of those meetings, and we tried to conduct as much as it's possible to do amongst three people to ensure that we asked the same sort of questions and took notes of all the responses and whatnot. So we've got a barrel load of bits of paper with all the notes that we took down of the things you said at these meetings. And one or two, we know from the registers we took at these meetings that 625 members participated. And my recollection, certainly of the ones that I was at, was that I don't recall anybody just sitting quiet and listening. Everybody was wanting to have their say. So we got views from 625 members, and they represented 349 U3As. We don't know how many of those 349 were in the 415 who responded to the questionnaire. So, but clearly some of them wouldn't have responded to the questionnaire. So maybe we reached about 50% response rate in total from those two activities alone. And 34 people from those 22 meetings actually took the trouble after that meeting to write to us about as a sort of follow-up response or submissions. And finally, we talked to the people who actually should have known best, and probably some people would say, we made sure we had a special meeting with all 14 that's 14 excluding us, of the other trustees to get their opinions on what they think or how they think the NEC could be improved. So we got 14 separate submissions there. And if you add up all the submissions and responses that were written either as emails, or most of them were emails, did get the occasional letter, then it actually adds up to exactly 100. The 100 people, that is. We actually received 114 submissions because there were about a dozen people who sent a second response, and there were 2 people who responded 3 times. So 114 separate submissions. Now, I take this opportunity to thank everybody who did write to us, generally by email, because some people put an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of thought into those submissions. The largest submission, I've got the figure here exactly, was 34 pages long. And there were very few that didn't extend to a couple of pages. So some people put a huge effort into that, and we do thank you enormously for that. Okay, so the consultation process took place like that. After the process had finished, then we sat down, the 3 of us, to start thinking about, well, what have we learned? What are we going to put in our report? And we used the focus group as our first group that we reported back to. We just saying to them, this is what we think we've heard, and this is what we're thinking of proposing. What do you think? And we did that also with the trustees. So they received the early versions, if you like, of our proposals and our thoughts and so on. And we have prepared a report. I have a copy of it here. It's a black and white one, but it's here. It will be available very shortly on the national website. It's 38 pages long, and so you will be able to download it. I'm not sure if Sam's around or whether she can give me a date, but yeah? No, you don't know a date. Yeah. Anyway, it will be going onto the website, and you will be able to download it and read the whole thing if you wish. We hope it's an objective analysis in the sense that it is not Ian, Michaela, and my opinions. We have tried resolutely to respond to what you told us and keep our own views completely out of sight. We tried to be as neutral as it was possible to be, as impartial as it was possible to be. And we believe that our report represents what the members told us. Obviously, we've had to condense it, otherwise, God knows how long it would have been. I know there's a pile of papers in my office at home. It must be about that high. So obviously we had to do a certain amount of condensation of the of what you told us. But we do believe it is an objective analysis of what you told us were your preferences and so on, not ours. There are four different appendices for the four of the different activities that I've just told you about, and we have deliberately put in those four appendices a great many quotations from the submissions that we received. That was quite deliberate, and we deliberately picked them to try to represent all the views. Because one thing we definitely found was that if there was a view to the far right on one issue, there were views to the far left on the same issue, and everything in between. So we've deliberately, about half the report is what you wrote. Admittedly selective, but we've tried to ensure that almost all the whole extreme of views are represented. And I think I'm right in saying, with one exception, every submission that you provided has got at least one quotation. One response, frankly, was contained of statements that we couldn't really put in. So there's a large number of appendices, but they're there just to give you an idea of the range of views that we received. Delighted to say that there is a management summary, and you should all have a copy. They were in your pack, so you should have this here. It's a stab at writing a management summary of the report. So if you're not inclined to read 38 pages of type, then do please read the management summary. Okay, so what does the report actually say? And I can only give a very brief summary here, but we fairly early on sort of found there were roughly 5 general themes that were coming up time and time again during the consultation. So I'm just going to include some of the principal points from each one. So as I go through the next set of 5 slides, can I just put out a health warning? If you see a gorilla, you're probably imagining it. But what I can assure you is that the pink elephants are real. Okay. The first theme was pretty obviously the National Executive Committee, how it's made up and so on. So the kind of themes that were coming out were, on the whole, the vast majority, or the majority of the members we spoke to were really pretty well settled in what we tended to call the status quo. There was no great appetite for huge changes, and certainly not radical ones. So that was clearly came out from every meeting we had. But there were one or two things. It was interesting that this morning Joe Coleman suggested that a board of a charity should be 13. Well, currently the National Executive Committee of the Third Age Trust can be 20. There are 16 elected trustees, but there's a facility to co-opt 3, and the past chairman has a right to continue to be a member for one further year. So you can have a maximum of 20 people on the current National Executive Committee. Normally there's 16. This year there's 17 because I was a co-opted trustee. But what we did find was that the sort of majority view was that they wanted to see or you wanted to see a National Executive Committee of round about 16 to 18. You thought that was an appropriate sort of size for the size of organisation and the membership that we have. And so there was support for a few measures that would reduce the size, or the maximum possible size, of the current National Executive Committee. And we'll come to those, and Michaela will say a bit about them, but there's a hint there, a reduction to 1 vice chair rather than the 2 we have at the moment, not having the past chair as a member, and also to tidy up the different tenures that the different trustees have. It's all a bit of a mixed bag of how many years people serve and so on. So there was support for those kind of simple measures that would require statutory change, and would probably get the membership down to that sort of 16 to 18 in total. So that was the sorts of things we were hearing. As I mentioned earlier, there was talk about, a lot of talk from some quarters about whether a much smaller skills-based National Executive Committee, maybe some were even suggesting less than 10, but 10 or 11 was quite normal, backed up with a statutory consultative or advisory forum. Well, the general response we got to that was that it was a second tier, or another tier of governance, and the last thing the members wanted was another tier of governance of the organisation. And a lot of fears that actually it would just finish up as a costly talking shop, because some people were saying it might have 40 people on it, representing the whole of the UK, being expensive to run, and so on. So there was no appetite, or no strong appetite anyway, for an extra tier of governance. And the general feeling was that if there wasn't the expertise needed and produced by the electoral system that produces the NEC, then there was no reason that there should not be short-term consultative or advisory groups set up with experience from all over the movement, and without having a statutory consultative committee. And there had been a lot to talk about whether there should be skills criteria in the National Executive Committee, that the electoral system was a bit like the political system we have in this country. You got who the electorate elected, whatever the skills might be. So you might well finish up with Joe's 16 accountants and so on. So a lot of people had argued there ought to be some sort of criteria. So that range was. That leads you into thinking about, should the NEC be appointed? If so, by whom? And who's going to make the judgments as to what their experiential background is, and so on. But generally, there was little support for that sort of thing. They preferred the electoral system that we have. The third theme was to do with the regional trustees. And the role is onerous. I know that. I've been one. And because actually it's two jobs, because there is a national governance job and there is the regional job to do that the regional trustees carry on. So there was a suggestion that the regional job be devolved down to volunteers, and that when somebody is elected by their region to the national executive, their job will become national. And not to say they won't be interested in what's going on in their own region, of course they would be, but the actual nitty-gritty day-to-day work in the region would be done by volunteers. And that seemed to be very much what people want, the split of the regional trustees' role. Strong support that the electoral system based on the current regions should be retained. Very little support for change of that. They mentioned earlier little support for retaining, for creating a skills-based criteria for trustee applications and appointment, and finally general support that the continuity of the NEC is a bit strange. It's 16 people on the whole, turning around every 3 years. You saw how many new trustees are coming onto the board this year. So the continuity of the NEC can be a problem sometimes, because new trustees take a little bit of time to settle in, and no sooner settled in than a new batch next year coming in. So the turnover is quite high. It's just about pretty much on 30% per year when you look back at how many turnovers there have been. So general agreement that we might do something about that. For example, to allow trustees to come up for re-election for another 2 years, so they have a maximum of 5 years possible, rather than the 3 years that we have at the moment. Fourthly, the regions themselves, I'll nip through, as I'm conscious time is going on. There's a lot of talk about demographic or democratic deficits related to the size of regions. Some regions are big, one trustee, some are quite small, one trustee. And there is an imbalance there in terms of the representative function of the trustees. But on the whole, people were not convinced by that argument, and the general feel was that they weren't concerned, and they leave the regions as they are. Even in the larger regions, that was the case. And the report, for example, does do some analysis of the responses to the questionnaire on this subject, and we find that never did a region vote up to 30% for splitting up into smaller portions. So if there was support for this sort of democratic imbalance to be sorted out, then the maximum we ever saw was about 30%, and most regions were barely up to 20% voting during the questionnaire, at least, for that to happen. So general message was leave the regions and the devolved country representation as they are. On the whole, throughout this consultation, we found very little variation between Scotland and the southwest and southeast. The views were surprisingly consistent, but the one thing that did come out was that the smaller regions were vehemently in favour of them remaining represented on the NEC, perhaps not surprisingly. The U3As in the larger regions, generally in the southern half of England, tended to relate more to the new networks rather than the region itself. So partly explaining why they didn't really go along with, even there, with the idea of splitting up some of the larger regions. The message was they don't want that. And then finally, this issue of networks. They're informal groupings, of course, and the message we got was very much they want to grow organically and no interference with that growth or who they represent or whatever. Let them happen organically. Although quite a number did say we are going to need some support, and we sort of read that actually they want money. But also other forms of support. One thing was very clear: they didn't want any role in the governance or management, if you want, of the trust or of the constituent U3As in the network. They wanted to be informal and to remain so. And finally, we got a very strong message about communication. And that, on the whole, U3As were not too happy sometimes with how the communication system works. And the strong feeling that they wanted the communication system to involve the networks. And so this phrase, network link, began to get used, and Ian will talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two. So those were the kinds of things that were coming up that we were hearing from during all the consultations. We then took those to the NEC, and we got 3 recommendations from the NEC. One was that this session should happen, that the findings should come to you at this AGM. So I am doing that now. In fact, I've done it. The second was that a full revision of the current memorandum and articles should be undertaken, and that they should be updated, and looking at an extraordinary general meeting in spring of 2018. So that we intend to do. And that the other recommendations, for example, on communication and so on, should also be implemented. So we got a well done, thanks very much, from the National Executive Committee, and who asked us to continue the work. So you'll see that those 3 recommendations are pretty much where I started when I introduced the members of the consultative group. I've just done number 1. Michaela is now going to do number 2, and then Ian will carry on after that. When Ian is finished, then we'll be delighted to sit down and take views and comments and so on from you. Thank you for listening. There you go.
Right, so I'm going to cover the proposed changes to the Memorandum and Articles of the Third Age Trust. And I can sort of hear you saying, well, why are you going to do that? Why should we update and renew? Sorry, is it that one? Why should we update and renew our Articles of Association and Memorandum? Now, the Charity Commission, as you will have gathered from what was said this morning, the Charity Commission recommends that all charities keep their governing document under review to ensure that it's up to date and it properly reflects what the charity does and how it operates. Now, if a charity is registered, trustees must keep the Charity Commission informed if they want to make any changes to the Articles and Memorandum. That's a given. And the trustees are accountable for administering their charity in accordance with their governing document. And this actually becomes rather difficult when the provisions of this document are out of date. And that's very much the situation that we found ourselves in. Currently, we have 2 separate governing documents, the Articles and the Memorandum of Association. Now, the Articles of Association were amended by a special resolution in May 2008 and also in September 2013. In May 2008, the change in composition of the Board of Trustees took place, and the regional trustees were now to be elected solely by their regions for the first time. composition of the board had been different before that. So we were now going to have 9 government regions and include the countries of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. In September 2013, a special resolution to deal with a particular situation which had manifested itself, and this was in the previous year, the trust could have actually found itself short of 4 trustees, when the trust only had the authority to co-opt 3 people. So we introduced a change about co-options in the September 13 proposals. So those are the articles and memorandum. The memorandum was actually approved by the General Meeting on the 6th of June in 1989, which is quite a long time ago. And both these documents were created under the Companies Act of 1985. And the Companies Act also, apologies for this, I have to keep my mind on having to click on there. So the Companies Act was reissued or reworked in 2006. And over the years, the revisions to this have been brought into play in several stages. Now, the last of the stages was actually in October 2009. And with effect from then, the memorandum and articles will be an articles-based document, so there will no longer be 2 separate governing documents. And the objects and all the operative provisions are in the Articles of Association. So the Memorandum of Association now becomes a document of historical significance only. The single document, it was agreed that the single document would set out the powers and regulate the administration of companies, and in our case, the Third Age Trust. It was agreed that companies who had been set up before October 2009 with a separate memorandum and articles didn't actually need to adopt this, as automatically the items from the memorandum we transferred to the articles. But it did suggest that it would be a useful opportunity for companies to review their articles to ensure that their provision was the provision in the memorandum was integrated into the articles and consistent, to do this as a sign of good practice. So, the Governance Committee had actually been working away for some time on the whole issue, and in February 2016 they actually recommended a review of the memorandum and articles of the Trust and their amalgamation into one document. So this would align with the current practice outlined in the Companies Act of 2006. It also highlighted those sections of the memorandum and articles which they felt should be amended because there were errors had slipped in, they needed corrections, things had changed, not been reflected, and there were a number of anomalies that really did need to be removed from these documents. So at the conclusion of the working group's consultation, which Graham has just taken you through, the working group included the recommendations of the Governance Committee in their recommendations to the National Executive Committee. So they actually proposed a number of changes to the Trust's articles, and the 3 articles involved were 36, 39 and 42. And they suggested updating things as follows. So to remove the ex-chairman as an ex officio member of the NEC, that was Article 36. Interestingly, quite a number of ex-chairmen chose not to stay on the NEC and come to the board meetings. So that wasn't anything that was going to cause a lot of problems. It was suggested that the officers should be elected for 3 years rather than annually. So at the moment, all the officers are elected and they have a term of office for 3 years. but they have to be reappointed at every AGM. Well, everybody knows that it's difficult to achieve a lot in 1 year and you've just about got going, so it seems an anomaly to insist that they're reappointed. So that's been suggested, and that is Article 39. It was also suggested that the role of the number of vice chairmen should be reduced to 1. It was felt that the particular job of a vice chairman is going to vary from time to time anyway, and it was felt that again it was appropriate to have 1 vice chairman. So that's Article 39. And as Graham's already mentioned, the proposal was to elect regional trustees for 3 years, but with an option for any regional trustee to be re-elected for a further 2 years if they chose to do so. And that was Article 42. And finally, to update the Trust's memorandum and articles, including those clauses relating to its charitable objects. So the intention now is to create a small working party, which is actually being created, and they will present their views or their findings or proposals to the NEC, because everything has to be approved by the NEC before it goes any further, before it's presented to you, the membership. And then the proposals, the NEC proposals will be presented to this extraordinary general meeting, which is going to be held in spring 2018, and which you will be asked to adopt the recommendations. So as you heard this morning, it's usual for a working group to have terms of reference, and they're fairly broad terms of reference for the Constitution Working Group. They're going to create a single articles document from the current memorandum and articles of association of the Third Age Trust. And they're going to remove all the inconsistencies and anomalies from the existing document. So you'll agree that does make sense. The Charity Commission doesn't know what it's talking about when it says you should keep an eye on your governing document, make sure it's not only up to date but consistent. Sorry, so yeah. Sorry, that's realised I've actually finished my presentation. Sorry, Ian.
Getting towards the end of a very long day, so very conscious to go through this very quickly and allow you to get home as soon as possible. But it was mentioned by Graham that there were non-structural points that were raised during the consultation process. They didn't relate to, didn't need any change to the Constitution at all, but they are worth going through now. And I will quickly go through some of the points that were raised and give you some answers if I can. The first one was, Graham has touched on it, there was a strong feeling that we should be encouraging and supporting the organic growth of networks. One of the things that really struck us was that there are over 60 networks across the country, and most U3As relate more to their network than they do to their regions. There is no wish, as was mentioned, to have an extra tier of governance, but there was some strong support that we should create a network link. This is a bit of a it's a work in progress, this title, because we're not quite sure what we're going to call it. But basically, it will be an informal meeting, perhaps twice a year, of networks, clusters, links, and some of the regional committees in the smaller regions which don't have networks. And the representatives from these networks will be able to will be invited to attend the meeting once initially. We'll see how it goes, maybe at the end of this year, to just exchange their views with the NEC about what they feel the Trust should be doing, and so we can communicate with them better. So there will be information about this towards the end of the year. So there we can just see what I've just been talking about. This is the current communication loop, and we hope that we will be able to improve that with this network link. Name yet to be confirmed. And this will give the networks, if they wish, there's no requirement to attend any of these meetings, but it may give them better access to the NEC via their trustee. It may be a vice chair organises this. And I've mentioned that it'd be a similar, be a meeting later this year. NEC subcommittees is another area. What we really appreciated, we did know this, but it was really brought home to us. There's a very deep reservoir of expertise within the U3A's 400,000 members. And there's already, as Pam has mentioned earlier, the NEC has started to open up NEC subcommittees and ad hoc working groups to non-trustees with the relevant skills and expertise. So the education subcommittee, the IT, the research committee and other committees will be recruiting members with skills in those particular areas to join them. And adverts have already appeared in Third Age Matters for those members who wish to apply. There was quite a bit of talk about the National Office. I don't know if you know that there are only 8 paid full-time and paid employees of National Office, and there was some feeling that the National Office should be expanded somewhat in order to support the growth in the movement, and also obviously the NEC. In recent months, just to update you with what's happened, in recent months Sophie Welling will be coming, I believe, next month, or not October, as Advice and Volunteer Manager. Fran Walton is an internal appointment, Education and Resources Manager. Kevin Traynor, who helped me a lot on the financial report, Finance Manager, and Liz Jory, who's been walking around talking to a lot of people, Communications Officer. These have been appointed. It's effectively not increased the number of staff by more than, I don't think, 1, but it has strengthened the National Office, and I think it is now in a very much better position than it was a year ago to support the movement. And we were encouraged all the time in these meetings that to ensure that we give advice rather than instruction. I hope we do not give the sense that we are giving instruction. We can only give you advice. Trustees. Well, Graham has mentioned this, to address the dual responsibility of trustees, and we will be gradually this is non-constitutional, obviously it doesn't affect any change to the Constitution, but we'll be gradually delegating parts of the RT's current regional duties to regional committees, networks, volunteers, taking account obviously of local circumstances, so that the regional trustee can focus more on their national governance, finance and leadership roles. And we've heard that nearly 100 people have already come forward to be trained as volunteers in the various areas that will assist the regional trustees. And the areas that we've been looking for are in creating new U3As, workshops to assist U3As manage their U3A, and troubleshooting. And the other area that was mentioned was communication. There was a consistent view that both internal and external communication could be more effective. And of course, I'm sure that Liz Jory will be improving that aspect of the communication process. Also, it was mentioned that all National Office mailings to be sent by email to members who have registered to receive them. Most of the mailings have been previously going to secretaries of U3As, but I think now most members can register and receive direct National Office mailings directly, so we can communicate far better with the membership. So if you wish to receive these mailings, then there is a facility to do so. Establish web forums on specific topics. This is a future way to communicate with members, and I certainly think that is the case, and we will be moving to do that. In fact, somebody came to me this morning over breakfast who'd attended the workshop I did on committees, successful committee, and she suggested, and she's going to provide a little paper on it, on the fact that there could be a forum for committee members to actually communicate with one another if they have a problem in their committee, just to actually see how other committee members address it. But so that may be an example of what we could do in the future. There's a suggestion that more information is obtained on the annual capitation fee about a particular U3A. We have done this. It was suggested that at the AGM, trustees are properly introduced, and there was a Q&A session. Well, the Q&A session took place on Tuesday evening, but we have improved the profile of the trustees with the membership at the AGM. Third age matters. There was a number of people, we've had John Lloyd talk about it this morning, all members to receive a copy of Third Age Matters free of charge. I did answer that point in the Treasurer's report. I mentioned the National Trust. Education, there was a strong view that there should be more emphasis on education by the Trust. And there are continuing efforts, which I'm sure you've heard about, to try and improve and increase the online learning platforms that are available to U3As through our own membership and also through online learning programs such as MOOCs. And the trials are taking place already on providing online courses for members who are not able to meet in traditional interest groups because of disability, lack of mobility, etc. And also encouragement should be given, this was mentioned, to establish links with local universities. That is taking place across the country, but that's very much up to the individual U3As to do that. Nationally, we can assist in the process, but the initiative has to come locally. The Trust, we're coming to the end now. Now, a lot of criticism about the fact that a lot of Trust events were London-focused and that there should be more emphasis on regional events. We constantly ask regions to suggest events in their region. As soon as somebody identifies a museum or a gallery that is willing to host an event in that region, then the resources of National Office will be available to do that. But we do need to try and broaden out the events that are funded by the Trust. The suggestion that we have a 5-year plan, we did have going forward, which is finished, and there will be a strategic plan coming out in the next year. The issue of the name university was raised quite a few times, as generally I have to say is a negative to the growth of our movement as opposed to a positive. The response from the Trust is that there is no intention to change the name of the University of the Third Trust. If members want to express their views on that, obviously we will listen to them. But that's something that's not on the agenda. And I've just mentioned that there. And then the last suggestion, which we've accepted totally, is that there should be a consultation process every 5 years. And we've accepted that because we will not be around then in order to conduct it. Thank you very much.
What I wanted to say to you before I do so is that we have a new website. I believe, did it go live last Friday? And you need a new login. That's a good thought to send you home with, isn't it? If you have problems, if you'd like to get in touch with the staff over the next couple of days, I should think they'll be absolutely worn out, but that's what it says here, queries in the next couple of days. So, sorry? No, you can do it yourself, hopefully. Yes. Anyway, thank you very much for staying on, and thank you for your attention, and have a very safe journey home. Thank you.